One of the studies that I was reading that you did, biochar is a propagation substrate. People have heard a lot about biochar. There's a lot. It's something people love to promote. I've talked to a lot of people on this podcast in the past about it, so I have my views based upon them. What's your current view first of biochar as a agricultural input?
That's a good question. I would say that my my attitude toward biochar has been a little dismaying to some companies that are selling biochar, and that is I'm still skeptical about the cost that comes with the product. I'm really excited about the concept of biochar. I love it. Love the idea of stabilizing carbon-based material, having it maintain its volume and be consistent and reliable. What I have concern about is by the time it goes through the processing to have a consistent pH and to have pore sizes that are predictable, it just becomes expensive relative to other things that could fill its niche. So in a production environment, it is, in a small container, we want it to be high performing. I sometimes call it designer biochar, really high performing biochar. And that's where I have concern about is economic sustainability right now, or being able to fit with a nursery. When it comes to being more informal and incorporating it in poor soil in a landscape environment or in an outdoor environment, even if you have a vegetable garden, on a property, I think it's really exciting in that phase because it's much more forgiving. It doesn't need to be so high performing and so consistent. So I love the idea. The reason I did the research I did was I was not seeing much tied to propagation, where you get small containers, small cell sizes, the effects are magnified. I was seeing more about fields and big containers, in larger growth environments. So that's why I did the research I did.
If you take it and you put it in and say substitute for a perlite, vermiculite, something that adds that airspace to it, what are your thoughts if we throw costs out of the window? Everything costs the
Mhm.
same. You have
Yes.
biochar and other choices sitting in front of you. Post research, would you go for the biochar in the
I
mix?
I I would. There are, which might seem like a petty thing, but there's the one thing that working with it is it stains. It is, as you're working with a fine char based project, this char does stain up your hands. It will stain up clothing if you get it on. And so when you're working with the product itself, once you get it into a substrate, it's not as much of an issue when you mix it with peat or mix it with other things. But in its raw form, in handling it, working with it, it was somewhat dirty, to work with. Now, I like getting my hands dirty, so that's not a big problem. But at the same time, if you're working with equipment, you're working in lab space. For instance, the lab where I did my research, after I'd be mixing the char, there would be light char dust, in on the benches and on the machinery that I was using that I have to clean up. The peat would leave very little residue, behind in that space. So there was that element that may be concerning, for a grower on a larger scale, but I really liked the performance. It was comparable to peat and to perlite in its performance. The only place that I saw a real difference was at very high rates, 80% char, and around that level, I was taking peat and perlite based substrates and amending them by volume percentage. So 20%, 40%, 60, 80. When I got up to 80%, I did start to see some differences in rooting of cuttings and also with growth of seedlings. And those changes are something that effectively cuttings were developing root systems that had a higher root count, so more roots initiated, but very small compared to the lower rates of biochar. So if I was going to visually depict it, with my hand, if I were to take a handout like this would say, okay, this was the root system when I had a 20% char. When I went to 80%, it looked like this, but it had 4 times the roots, right? Or 3 times the roots. So they were short and highly branched, but not extended and growing out. And I have not been able to explain what that is, chemical or physical, that led to that outcome. I tried a little follow up to understand it better, and didn't reach closure on that or have an answer to that. But if I avoided those very high rates, and that was intriguing, even if I get that high branching, could I do that to initiate all those roots and then maybe modify the substrate, or do a transplant and see a very dense root system? I found that intriguing. But the biggest drawback to me as a product would really be the cost at this point.
Is consistency an issue? That's one thing, I know from talking to some people, it's tough to study biochar because it's all that's a classification, but that's an umbrella with a million things under it. What
Yeah.
was it made out of? What is the pore space? What temperature was it pyrolyzed at? Where
Yeah.
I would think perlite is perlite for the most part,
Mhm.
and it's more or less uniform, where when you get into biochar, it's not uniform, and it can mean all different things. So, the biochar you tested with could be completely different than what I use and try, and we could get different results.
That's a very good point. Yes, I think of biochar and soil, as being in kind of, if you're doing an apple to apple, biochar and soil, I think fits better than like a biochar perlite or biochar, even peat. Peat has some variability. You have hypnum peat and sphagnum peat and reed sedge peat, in different classifications, but they're still pretty similar, in how they operate.